They rewrote the textbooks, painted over the faces, changed every image you've ever seen, and for over 1,000 years, no one questioned it. No one asked why. No one wondered where the truth went. Until now. Picture this. You're sitting in a library. Ancient manuscripts spread across the table. Crumbling pages. Faded ink. And as you translate the Latin, you realize something impossible. The man who invented the word Trinity, the single most important concept in Christianity, wasn't European. He was African. Black African. From Carthage. Your hands start shaking. Because if this is true, if this one fact is real, then everything else you were taught might be a lie. The genius who organized the Bible as we know it? African. The bishop who saved Christianity from complete collapse? African. The philosopher whose ideas shaped 1,500 years of Western thought? African. But here's what makes your blood run cold. These weren't minor figures. These weren't side characters in someone else's story. These were the architects, the builders, the founding fathers of Christianity itself. And someone erased them. Deliberately. Systematically. So completely that you've been going to church your whole life and never heard their names. Tonight, you're going to discover who they were, what they built, and why the world spent 1,000 years trying to make you forget. Because what you're about to learn doesn't just change history. It destroys everything you thought you knew about Christianity. The year is 155 AD. North Africa. The city of Carthage, in what is now Tunisia. The Roman Empire controls the region, but something is happening here that Rome doesn't understand. Can't control. Something that will change the world forever. A man sits in a study. Scrolls everywhere. Ink-stained fingers. His name is Tertullian. And he's about to solve a problem that's tearing Christianity apart. See, Christianity has a language problem. The New Testament was written in Greek. The early debates, Greek. The theology, Greek. But there's a massive issue. The Roman Empire speaks Latin. If Christianity is going to spread across the Western world, it needs to speak Latin too. But it's not just translation. The Latin language doesn't have words for Christian concepts. There's no word for Trinity. No word for salvation in the Christian sense. No vocabulary for the theological ideas that define the faith. Tertullian stares at the blank page. He knows what he has to do. He has to create the language. Invent the words. Build the vocabulary from scratch. And he does. The word Trinity, Father, Son, Holy Spirit as one God in three persons, that's Tertullian's invention. The theological framework that defines Christian orthodoxy? Tertullian wrote it. The famous quote, "The blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church." Those are Tertullian's words. This man wrote over 30 works of theology, philosophy, and apologetic. He defended Christians when Rome was hunting them down. He argued with officials, with heretics, with anyone who challenged the faith. He was brilliant, fearless, revolutionary. And he was a Berber. A black African from North Africa. But here's the question that should haunt you. Why don't you know his name? Why isn't he taught in every church history class? Why isn't he celebrated alongside Augustine and Aquinas? I'll tell you why. Because acknowledging Tertullian means acknowledging something far more dangerous. It means admitting that the intellectual foundation of Western Christianity, the language, the terminology, the theology, came from Africa. From a black man. And for over 1,000 years, that didn't fit the narrative. The narrative was that Africa was backward. That civilization came from Europe. That Christianity was a white man's religion. But Tertullian destroys that lie with his existence. He was writing sophisticated theology in the 2nd century, while most of Europe was still being Christianized. He was defining Christian orthodoxy before European churches even existed. So how did they erase him? Simple. Later European scholars acknowledged his work but buried his African identity. They focused on his Roman citizenship, not his Berber ethnicity. They translated his Latin but forgot to mention where he wrote it, where he lived, what he looked like. They whitewashed his legacy. And that was just the beginning. Because Tertullian wasn't even the most important African theologian. Not even close. What came next was something no one expected. Alexandria, Egypt. 184 AD. The largest library in the ancient world. Hundreds of thousands of manuscripts. Scholars from across the Mediterranean traveling here to study. This is the intellectual capital of the known world. The Harvard, MIT, and Oxford of antiquity combined. And in this city, a boy is born who will become the most brilliant mind Christianity has ever seen. His name is Origen. By the time he's 18, Origen is teaching. Not just teaching, he's the head of the Christian school in Alexandria. Students flock to him. Philosophers debate him. And he's writing. Constantly writing. 6,000 works. 6,000. Let that number sink into your mind. That's more than almost any other theologian in history, African, European, or otherwise. Most of his works are lost now, destroyed, burned, erased. But what survived is staggering. Origen didn't just write theology. He wrote biblical commentary, philosophy, apologetic, sermons, letters. He was a one-man intellectual revolution. But here's what really changed everything. Origen created the hexapla. You've probably never heard of it. But every Bible translation you've ever read, King James, NIV, ESV, traces its roots back to what Origen invented. The hexapla was a massive parallel Bible that arranged the Old Testament in 6 columns. Hebrew transliterated into Greek. 4 different Greek translations. Side by side. Word by word. So scholars could compare them. Find errors. Discover what the original text actually said. Origen was the first person to systematically analyze biblical manuscripts. Without him, modern biblical scholarship doesn't exist. The Bible you read today exists because an African genius in Egypt pioneered the method 1,500 years before modern scholars claim to invent it. And that's not all. Allegorical interpretation, the idea that Bible stories have deeper symbolic meanings, Origen developed that. Concepts about the soul, the image of God in humanity, spiritual warfare? Origen shaped all of it. But here's where the story gets dark. Rome didn't like him. Origen was too smart. Too independent. Too willing to ask dangerous questions. He believed in universal salvation, the idea that eventually everyone, even Satan, could be redeemed. The church couldn't accept that. So after his death, they condemned some of his teachings. They burned his books. Thousands of manuscripts. Gone. They tried to erase his influence from history. But they couldn't. Because his ideas were already embedded in Christian thought. Even the theologians who condemned him were using his methods, his vocabulary, his framework. Origen's legacy is everywhere. In every seminary. In every Bible commentary. In every theological debate. You just weren't told it came from an African scholar in Egypt. Ancient sources describe his connection to the Coptic Christian community. Many scholars believe he had African heritage, Ethiopian, Nubian, or Afro-Egyptian. But regardless of his exact ethnicity, one thing is undeniable. He was African. He worked in Africa. His genius emerged from African intellectual centers. And they tried to bury him. Because brilliant African minds didn't fit the story Europe wanted to tell. But what happened next was something nobody could erase. Something so important that without it, Christianity itself might not have survived. The year is 325 AD. The Roman Empire. Christianity is legal now, but it's tearing itself apart from the inside. A theological civil war is raging. The question that's dividing the entire faith, is Jesus fully divine, or was he created by God the Father? A priest named Arius is teaching that Jesus is a created being. Powerful, yes. Important, yes. But not equal to God. Not eternal. Not truly divine. And this idea, Arianism, is spreading like wildfire. Emperors support it. Bishops endorse it. Churches are splitting. Violence is erupting. It looks like Christianity might fracture into 1,000 pieces and disappear into history. If Arianism wins, modern Christianity dies. The entire doctrine of the Trinity collapses. Everything changes. The Emperor Constantine is desperate. He calls a council. Nika. In modern-day Turkey. He gathers bishops from across the empire. Over 300 of them. And he gives them one order: Settle this. Now. The debate is fierce. Arius argues his case. His supporters are powerful. The political pressure is immense. It looks like he might win. But then a young man stands up. A deacon from Alexandria, Egypt. He's short, dark-skinned, Egyptian. His name is Athanasius. And what he does next saves Christianity. Athanasius argues with a passion, an intelligence, a conviction that silences the room. He doesn't just quote scripture, he demolishes Arius's arguments systematically. He explains why Jesus must be fully God. Why the Trinity is essential. Why anything less destroys the entire faith. He fights against emperors, against bishops, against overwhelming political pressure. And he wins. The council produces the Nicene Creed, the statement of faith that billions of Christians still recite today. And Athanasius was one of its chief architects. But no one expected what happened next. The Arian emperors weren't done. They exiled Athanasius. Sent him away. Tried to silence him. But he came back. They exiled him again. He came back. 5 times. 5 times they exiled him. 5 times he returned. For 40 years, Athanasius fought. He wrote treatises. He preached. He hid in the Egyptian desert when assassins came for him. He refused to back down. He refused to compromise. He refused to let Christianity be destroyed. And because of him, this short, dark-skinned African bishop from Egypt, Christianity survived. But here's the truth they tried to bury. Historical sources describe Athanasius explicitly. Short, dark-skinned, Egyptian, from the Coptic Christian community. Yet if you look at medieval paintings of the Council of Nicaea, what do you see? Athanasius portrayed as a pale-skinned European. White skin. European features. The man who saved Christianity was literally whitewashed in art. Why? Because European Christians couldn't accept that their orthodoxy, the very definition of correct belief, was defended by a black African bishop. Think about that. The reason you believe Jesus is God. The reason the Trinity is central to your faith. The reason Christianity didn't collapse in the 4th century. Thank Athanasius. A dark-skinned Egyptian who refused to let the truth die. But even he wasn't the most influential. That title belongs to someone whose name you definitely know, but whose African identity was buried so deep, you probably never knew it existed. His name is Augustine. And if you understand his story, you understand how the entire cover-up worked. You've heard of Augustine of Hippo. If you've been to church, his name has been mentioned. If you've studied philosophy, you've read his work. If you've taken a theology class, he's unavoidable. He's one of the most important thinkers in human history. Period. His autobiography, Confessions, is one of the greatest books ever written. His work City of God shaped politics, ethics, and religion for centuries. Original sin? That's Augustine. Predestination? Augustine. Just war theory? Augustine. The relationship between church and state? Augustine. The nature of time, free will versus grace. The problem of evil, Augustine. When Martin Luther started the Protestant Reformation, he was building on Augustine's ideas. When John Calvin developed Reformed theology, he was quoting Augustine. When Catholic theologians debate doctrine, they reference Augustine. This man's influence is almost impossible to overstate. Every Christian denomination traces its theology back through him. He is the foundation. But here's what they didn't tell you. Augustine was born in 354 AD in Thagast, modern-day Algeria, North Africa. His mother, Monica, was Berber. His father was Roman. Augustine himself identified as African. He spoke the Berber language. He spent most of his life in North Africa. He was a Berber from Algeria. A black African. But look at the paintings. Renaissance art. Medieval manuscripts. Stained glass windows. Augustine is portrayed as a pale-skinned European man, often with light hair, sometimes blonde. That's not history. That's erasure. Western Christianity claimed Augustine as its own. They wanted his brilliance, his theology, his influence. But they didn't want to admit where it came from. They stripped away his African identity and replaced it with a European facade. Imagine if every textbook told the truth. If every church taught that the most influential Christian philosopher of all time was a black African from Algeria. How would that change the conversation? How would that change how black students see themselves? How would that reshape Christianity itself? But instead, Augustine is presented as universal, which in practice means white. His African roots are mentioned as a footnote, if at all. And the question you need to ask yourself is this: why is it so hard for people to accept that the greatest minds of early Christianity were black Africans? What does that say about how history is written? About who gets remembered and who gets erased? Because Augustine isn't alone. There's another name you need to know. Another African whose work shaped the very structure of Christianity. Cyprian of Carthage. Born around 200 AD in North Africa. A bishop. A martyr. And one of the most important organizers of the early church. Cyprian wrote extensively on church unity, the role of bishops, how Christians should handle persecution. But here's what changed everything. Cyprian helped establish the structure of the church as we know it today. The hierarchy of bishops. The concept of church authority. The idea that the church is a visible, organized institution. Without Cyprian, there's no Catholic Church. There's no episcopal structure. There's no organized Christianity as you know it. He famously said, "He cannot have God as his father who does not have the church as his mother." That idea, that the church is essential to salvation, shaped Christian thought for centuries. And he was African. Born in Carthage. Executed by Romans in 258 AD for refusing to renounce his faith. But Cyprian wasn't working alone. He was part of a massive network of African scholars. Carthage had schools. Alexandria had libraries. Nubia had monasteries. These weren't isolated thinkers. They were part of an intellectual tradition. Historians estimate that over 100 significant theologians came out of North Africa in the first 5 centuries of Christianity. Most of their works are lost. Most of their names are forgotten. But their ideas are still here. Embedded in every Christian doctrine. Every church structure. Every theological debate. Africa wasn't just part of early Christianity. Africa was the intellectual engine. The powerhouse. The foundation. So how did this get erased? How do you bury an entire continent's contribution to the world's largest religion? It didn't happen by accident. It was deliberate. Systematic. And it happened over centuries. First, the European Renaissance. Starting in the 1400s, European scholars became obsessed with reclaiming classical heritage, Greek philosophy, Roman law, European art. They rewrote history to center Europe. African contributions were downplayed or ignored. Maps literally started leaving African intellectual centers off the historical record. Second, colonialism. From the 1500s onward, European powers colonized Africa. And to justify that colonization, they needed a narrative. Africa was backward, uncivilized, in need of European enlightenment. But that narrative falls apart if you admit that Africa was once the intellectual center of Christianity. So the solution? Erase it. Claim that civilization came from Europe, not Africa. Paint Africa as a place that needed saving, not a place that once saved Christianity. Third, church politics. By the medieval period, Rome wanted to be the center of Christianity. The Pope wanted absolute authority. But acknowledging that the theological foundation came from Africa meant admitting that the center was once somewhere else. So Rome claimed the legacy without the geography. They took the theology, the structure, the ideas, but erased where it all came from. Fourth, academic racism. In the 18th and 19th centuries, scholars developed racial theories that ranked civilizations. Europeans at the top. Africans at the bottom. Ancient history was rewritten to fit this narrative. African theologians were either ignored or reclassified as not really African. And fifth, art. Medieval and Renaissance artists painted biblical and historical figures as white Europeans. Athanasius, white. Augustine, white. Even Jesus, blonde-haired and blue-eyed. These images became the default. And images shape perception. If you grow up seeing only white saints, only white theologians, only white church fathers, you assume Christianity is a white religion. But it's not. It never was. Here's the question you should be asking. Why does the world know Plato and Aristotle but not Athanasius and Origen? Why does your history class talk about European monks but not the African bishops who shaped the entire religion? Why is Augustine taught as a universal thinker, but his African identity is buried? The answer is uncomfortable. But it's necessary. Because this isn't just about the past. This is about how history is told. About who gets remembered. About whose contributions count. And if we're being honest, African contributions have been systematically erased, downplayed, or whitewashed. But here's what they couldn't erase. What survived despite everything. Even though these theologians were buried in mainstream history, their influence never went away. It couldn't. Because it's everywhere. Every time a pastor talks about the Trinity, that's Tertullian. Every time you read a Bible commentary, that's Origen's method. Every time Christians recite the Nicene Creed, that's Athanasius. Every time Protestant theology mentions grace and sin, that's Augustine. Every time a church has bishops and structure, that's Cyprian. The theology is African. The intellectual framework is African. The foundations of Christianity are African. And in some places, that memory never died. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church still traces its roots to the earliest days of Christianity. The Coptic Christians in Egypt still celebrate their ancient heritage. Scholars in Africa are now reclaiming this history. Writing books. Teaching courses. Reminding the world what was stolen. There's a growing movement, especially among Black theologians and historians, to recover these lost voices. To put Africa back into the story where it belongs. Because this isn't about taking anything away from anyone. This is about telling the full story. The true story. Christianity is a global faith. It was shaped by people from every continent, Asia, Africa, Europe, and later the Americas. But for too long, only one part of that story has been told. It's time to tell the rest. So let's come back to where we started. What if I told you that Christianity wasn't built in Europe? You'd probably be skeptical. Because that's not what you were taught. That's not what the paintings show. That's not what the textbooks say. But now you know the truth. Christianity was shaped, intellectually, theologically, spiritually, by Black Africans. By men like Tertullian, Origen, Athanasius, Augustine, and Cyprian. These weren't footnotes. These weren't side characters. They were the architects. And their legacy is everywhere. In every church. In every Bible. In every doctrine. The only question is, why did it take so long for you to hear about them? Maybe it's because history is written by the powerful. Maybe it's because empires erase what they conquer. Maybe it's because racism runs deeper than we want to admit. But here's what matters now. You know. You can't unknow this. You can't go back to thinking Christianity is just a European story. Because it's not. It's a human story. An African story. A story of brilliant minds who changed the world. The man who invented the word Trinity? African. The genius who organized biblical scholarship? African. The bishop who saved Christianity? African. The philosopher who shaped Western thought? African. The organizer who structured the church? African. They tried to erase them. They painted over their faces. They buried their names. They rewrote the textbooks. But the truth survived. It waited. And now it's here. What are you going to do with that knowledge? Are you going to dig deeper? Read their works? Share this story? Or are you going to let it get buried again? That's up to you. But remember this. Every time you hear the word Trinity, think of Tertullian in Carthage. Every time you read the Bible, think of Origen in Alexandria. Every time you recite the Nicene Creed, think of Athanasius standing alone against emperors. They were African. They were brilliant. They built Christianity. And no one can erase that truth ever again.